The picture that changed everything. The late afternoon sun bathed the small town in a golden glow, casting long shadows across the streets. Officer Mike Thompson cruised down Main Street in his patrol car, his window rolled down to let in the warm breeze. It was a peaceful day. The kind of day that made his job feel less like work and more like a privilege. Families strolled the sidewalks, children played in front yards, and the aroma of freshly baked bread drifted from the local bakery. Yet something gnawed at Mike's gut. A feeling. An instinct. As he approached Riverside Park, his trained eyes scanned the bustling scene. Joggers, dog walkers, groups of teenagers, and parents watching their children on the playground. It was a familiar picture of small-town life, but amidst the activity, a single figure sat alone on a worn-out wooden bench. A boy. He looked around 7 or 8 years old, small for his age, with messy dark hair and a thin frame. His clothes were dirty and tattered, worn-out sneakers barely holding together, jeans with frayed cuffs, and a jacket that looked too big for him. The boy's posture was hunched, his small hands clutching something in his lap, and his gaze was distant, as if he wasn't really seeing the world around him. Mike's stomach tightened. He had been on the force for over a decade, and in that time, he had learned to trust his instincts. Something was wrong. Kids didn't sit alone in parks, looking like ghosts of themselves, unless they had nowhere else to go. Pulling over, Mike put his patrol car in park and stepped out. His boots crunched on the gravel as he approached, but the boy didn't look up. "Hey there, buddy," Mike greeted, keeping his voice soft and warm. He crouched down to the boy's level, careful not to spook him. "My name's Officer Mike. Are you okay?" The boy flinched slightly at the voice, but didn't run. Slowly, his dark eyes lifted to meet Mike's, and what Mike saw made his heart clench. Fear, hope, and something even worse. Desperation. The boy licked his lips as if trying to find his voice, but no words came out. "It's okay," Mike assured him. "You don't have to talk if you don't want to. I just want to make sure you're safe." After a few long moments, the boy finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sam." Mike nodded. "That's a good name, Sam. Are you here alone?" A hesitant nod. Mike felt his heart sink. "Where are your parents, kid?" At the mention of parents, something inside Sam seemed to crack. His small fingers trembled as he reached into the oversized jacket he wore, pulling out a crumpled and slightly torn photograph. Without a word, he extended it toward Mike. Mike took it carefully, smoothing out the wrinkles. The image showed a happy family, a man, a woman, and a younger version of Sam. They were smiling, standing in front of what looked like a small house with white siding and blue shutters. The picture had the faded quality of an old memory, a moment frozen in time. Mike's throat tightened. "Is this your family?" Sam nodded, a single tear rolling down his cheek. "I can't find them," he whispered. Mike's heart ached at the raw pain in the boy's voice. "When was the last time you saw them?" Sam's lip quivered. "A long time ago." Mike took a deep breath. "Do you remember what happened? Where did you last see them?" The boy hesitated before shaking his head. I woke up, and they were gone." A bad feeling crept up Mike's spine, and he turned the photograph over, checking the back. There was a faded date written in pen, along with a name, Daniel and Laura Willows. Willows. Mike frowned. The name tickled something in the back of his memory, something from an old case file. Then he noticed something else. In the background of the picture, partially obscured by the family's smiling faces, was another figure, a man. He was standing just behind them, near the house, and even though the image was slightly blurred, Mike felt his stomach drop. The man in the background looked eerily familiar. He swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. He knew that face. He had seen it before, in old mugshots, in reports from the department. It was Daniel Willows, and Daniel Willows had been wanted for years. Mike's grip tightened on the photograph. He looked back at Sam, who was watching him with big, hopeful eyes. completely unaware of the storm that had just started brewing inside Mike's head. He needed to call this in. Now, reaching for his radio, he pressed the button, keeping his voice steady. "Dispatch, this is Officer Mike Thompson. I need backup at Riverside Park. Possible missing child case. Over." The radio crackled. "Copy that, Officer Thompson. ETA 5 minutes." Mike took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. He didn't know what was going on yet, but one thing was clear. This was more than just a lost boy. And Sam had no idea that the man he was searching for, the father he loved, was a fugitive. Shadows of the past. The flashing blue and red lights of the patrol cars cast eerie patterns over the park as dusk settled in. The evening air, once warm and inviting, now carried a chill that seemed to seep into Officer Mike Thompson's bones. As the backup officers arrived, he remained crouched beside Sam, gripping the crumpled photograph in his hand. The boy was trembling slightly, his small fingers clutching his knees. He didn't look frightened of the police. He looked frightened of being left alone again. Mike turned his head slightly as Officer Johnson, a veteran officer with over 20 years on the force, approached. The older man's salt and pepper hair was slightly disheveled, his sharp eyes scanning the situation before settling on the picture in Mike's hand. "What's the situation, Thompson?" Johnson asked, keeping his voice low. Mike handed over the photograph without a word. Johnson took it, his eyes narrowing as he studied the faces. "Kid says he's looking for his parents," Mike explained. "The names on the back, Daniel and Laura Willows." Johnson stiffened immediately, his face darkening. "Willows?" He looked at Mike sharply. "As in Daniel Willows?" Mike nodded grimly. "I think so." Johnson let out a long breath, shaking his head. "Damn. That name hasn't come up in a long time. What do you remember about the case?" Mike pressed. Johnson ran a hand down his face, still staring at the photo. "Years ago, Daniel Willows was a suspect in a high-profile fraud case involving some very powerful people. Word was, he got caught up with the wrong crowd. When the case went south, he disappeared, vanished without a trace. Some believed he fled the country. Others thought he was taken out by the people he double-crossed." Mike glanced back at Sam, who was watching their conversation closely, though he couldn't hear every word. "I don't think this kid knows any of that," Mike muttered. "As far as he's concerned, his dad just vanished." Johnson sighed, rubbing his chin. "If Willows is still alive, he's been in hiding for a long time. And if someone wanted him gone, they might not be too happy that his kid is looking for him." Mike felt a weight settle on his chest. He had suspected something was off about this situation from the start, but now it felt like they had walked into a much bigger problem. Mike turned back to Sam and crouched beside him again. "Sam, buddy," he said gently, "I need to ask you some important questions, okay?" The boy nodded hesitantly. "Where have you been staying?" Mike asked. Sam hesitated, then shrugged. "Here and there. Sometimes a shelter. Sometimes with nice people. But I always keep looking for Dad." Mike's stomach twisted at the thought of Sam wandering the streets alone. "How long have you been on your own?" The boy frowned, thinking. "A while. Maybe a year." His voice was small, unsure. Mike inhaled sharply. A year. This kid had been living without a stable home for a whole year. "How did you get to this town?" he asked. Sam shrugged again. "A lady at a shelter gave me a bus ticket. She said it might help me find my dad." Mike exchanged a look with Johnson. That meant someone else had known about this. Someone had been helping Sam, even if indirectly. "Do you remember the lady's name?" Johnson asked. Sam thought for a moment before shaking his head. She had gray hair. She was nice. Mike took mental note of that. Maybe they could track her down later. "Sam," he said carefully, "do you remember the last time you saw your dad? What happened?" Sam bit his lip. His big brown eyes were filled with uncertainty, and he seemed to struggle with the answer. "I don't know," he finally said. "I just woke up one day, and he was gone. Mom too." Mike's frown deepened. That didn't sound like a family running away together. It sounded like something worse. "Did your dad ever tell you anything before he left? Did he seem worried or scared?" Sam shook his head. "Dad always smiled. He always said we were safe. But sometimes I saw him looking out the window a lot, like he was waiting for something." Mike's pulse quickened. That was the behavior of a man on the run. But running from who? "Okay, buddy," he said, ruffling Sam's hair gently. "We're going to figure this out together, all right?" Sam nodded, his tiny fingers clutching the photograph like a lifeline. Mike stood up, turning back to Johnson. "I want to take him to the station, get him some food, maybe a shower. He looks exhausted." Johnson nodded. "Yeah. And while you do that, I'll pull the old case files on Daniel Willows. Maybe there's something we missed." Mike led Sam to the patrol car, opening the passenger door for him. The boy hesitated. Am I in trouble?" Sam asked quietly. Mike's heart ached at the question. "No, buddy. You're not in trouble. We're just going to help you, okay?" Sam nodded slowly and climbed inside. As Mike shut the door and walked around to the driver's side, he couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing inside him. Something wasn't right about this, and he had a feeling that by trying to help Sam, he was about to stir up trouble that had been buried for years. Later that night, the police station. The station was quieter than usual when they arrived. Most of the officers had gone home, and only a skeleton crew remained. Mike led Sam into a small room with a couch, a table, and a few chairs. "All right, buddy. Let's get you something to eat." One of the station clerks, a kind woman named Marcia, brought in a plate of warm food, a sandwich, some apple slices, and a juice box. Sam ate quietly, his small fingers gripping the sandwich like it was the first real meal he'd had in days. As Sam ate, Mike sat across from him, watching the boy with a mix of worry and determination. "Sam," he said gently, "we're going to try to find out what happened to your parents, but I need you to be honest with me about everything you remember, okay?" Sam nodded, wiping his mouth. "Okay." Mike took a deep breath. "You said your dad used to look out the window a lot. Did he ever tell you why?" Sam shook his head. "But one time, I heard him talking on the phone. He didn't know I was listening." Mike leaned in slightly. "What did he say?" Sam's brow furrowed as he tried to remember. He said, "It's not safe anymore. We have to move." And then he said, "I won't let them take my family." Mike's stomach knotted. Who was he talking about? Who was trying to take his family? As if the universe had heard his thoughts, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Pulling it out, he saw a message from Johnson. "Mike, you need to see this. Now, come to records." Mike glanced at Sam, who was watching him curiously. "Stay here, buddy," Mike said, standing. "I'll be right back." He stepped out of the room and walked briskly down the hall to the records office, where Johnson was waiting, his face pale. "I found something," Johnson said, motioning for Mike to look at the computer screen. Mike leaned in, his heart pounding as he read. Daniel Willows wasn't just a suspect in a fraud case. His wife, Laura Willows, was a witness in a federal investigation, and she disappeared the same time he did. Mike's breath hitched. "Wait, are you saying Laura Willows was in witness protection?" Johnson nodded grimly. "If she was, and she vanished, it means someone got to her." Mike swallowed hard. This wasn't just a missing person case. It was something much bigger, and Sam was right in the middle of it. A trail of lies. The weight of the revelation pressed down on Officer Mike Thompson like a steel vise. He stared at the record screen, the dim glow illuminating his tense expression. Laura Willows had been placed in witness protection. Then she vanished. No trace. No updates. No leads. It didn't make sense. If the government had put her into hiding, how had she disappeared? Mike turned to Officer Johnson, who still looked pale. "Does this mean what I think it means?" Mike asked. Johnson rubbed his chin, his expression troubled. "It means someone got to her, either the people she testified against or someone on the inside helped make her disappear." Mike's jaw clenched. An inside job. That would explain why no one had ever questioned her disappearance before. Someone with authority had buried it deep. "Does the system show any activity on her case in the last few years?" Mike asked. Johnson typed rapidly, scanning through the database. After a few moments, he shook his head. "Nothing. No new entries since her initial placement in witness protection. If she's alive, the system doesn't show it." Mike exhaled sharply. That was bad news. Either Laura Willows was dead, or she had found a way to stay hidden, even from the people who were supposed to be protecting her. "Pull up Daniel Willows," Mike said. "Let's see if his records show anything new." Johnson searched Daniel's name, and the results were sparse. The fraud case, the missing persons report, but something caught Mike's eye. "Wait, go back." Johnson scrolled up. "A police report filed 2 months ago." Mike's heart started to pound. "Open it." The document loaded, revealing a brief and vague report from a small-town sheriff's office in Colorado. It mentioned an unidentified man fitting Daniel Willows' description, who had been seen in a remote motel outside Denver. 2 months ago, Johnson muttered. "That's recent." Mike narrowed his eyes. He's still out there. But why hadn't anyone followed up? Why had this report just been buried? The pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, and Mike didn't like the picture they were forming. If Daniel had resurfaced, it meant he was either running again or trying to find Laura. And if someone had buried Laura's case, then the same people might be after Daniel. Mike's gut twisted as another thought hit him like a punch to the stomach. And now Sam was searching for them. If someone didn't want Daniel or Laura found, then Sam wandering around looking for them could be a serious problem. Mike pushed away from the desk and stood. "We need to move fast." Johnson frowned. "What are you thinking?" Mike grabbed his phone. "I'm thinking if Daniel Willows is still alive, someone's either protecting him or hunting him." Johnson's face darkened. "And if it's the second one, we might already be too late." Back at the station, 11:45 p.m. Mike returned to the small holding room where Sam was waiting. The boy had curled up in a chair, his arms wrapped around himself, but he was still awake. His brown eyes lifted as Mike entered. "Did you find my dad?" he asked quietly. Mike exhaled, running a hand through his hair. He crouched down beside Sam. "We might have found something, but it's not enough yet. I need you to be patient, okay?" Sam nodded slowly, but the light of hope in his eyes flickered. Mike hesitated for a moment before asking, "Sam, I need you to think really hard. Before your dad disappeared, did he ever tell you anything about where you might go if something bad happened? A safe place?" Sam's brow furrowed in concentration. He bit his lip and shook his head. "No, but..." Mike leaned in. "But what?" Sam swallowed. He had a map. A big one. He looked at it a lot. Mike's pulse quickened. "Do you remember anything about the map? What was on it?" Sam shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know. He folded it up and kept it in a drawer, but I saw him circle something on it once." Mike's breath caught. "Do you remember what he circled?" Sam hesitated. "There was a star on it, and a name." "A name?" Mike prompted gently. The boy's face scrunched in thought. "Eagle. Something. Eagle's Rest. No, Eagle's Peak. I think that was it." Mike exchanged a glance with Johnson, who had been standing at the door. Johnson immediately pulled out his phone and started searching. "Eagle's Peak," he muttered, scrolling through maps. "There's a small town by that name about an hour outside Denver." Mike turned back to Sam. "Sam, do you think your dad might have gone there?" Sam's small shoulders lifted. "I don't know, but he looked at the map a lot. Maybe." Mike straightened, determination hardening in his gut. That's our next lead. Johnson nodded. If Willows is alive, and he's been hiding for this long, he wouldn't just pick any random place. He went there for a reason. Mike looked down at Sam. I think we're getting close, buddy. Sam's grip tightened on the photograph in his hands. Will you take me there? Mike hesitated. We have to be careful, Sam. If your dad is hiding, there's a reason. And if we go looking for him, we might attract the wrong kind of attention. Sam looked at him with unwavering determination. I have to find him. Mike felt a lump form in his throat. This kid had been through so much. He had every reason to give up, to accept his loss. But instead, he was still fighting. Mike glanced at Johnson, then exhaled sharply. All right, we leave in the morning. Sam's face brightened slightly, and for the first time that night, he smiled. The next morning, on the road to Eagles Peak, the highway stretched endlessly ahead, winding through the mountains as Mike drove toward Eagles Peak. Johnson was in the passenger seat, flipping through old case files, while Sam sat quietly in the back, staring out the window. It had been a long time since Mike had taken on a case that felt this personal. He had always been dedicated to his job, but this was different. He wasn't just investigating, he was protecting. And deep down, he knew he would do anything to keep Sam safe. As they neared the small town, Mike's phone buzzed. He answered on speaker. Thompson, he said. A distorted voice came through. You're making a mistake, officer. The air in the car went ice cold. Mike's hands clenched the steering wheel. Who is this? Turn around, the voice continued. You don't know what you're walking into. Mike's heart pounded. Is this about Daniel Willows? Where is he? The voice ignored his question. You were warned. Leave the boy and forget what you found. Then the line went dead. Mike gritted his teeth. Well, that just confirmed one thing. Johnson exhaled. That we're pissing off the right people. Mike nodded grimly. Exactly. Sam's small voice cut through the tension. Does this mean my dad is really in danger? Mike met the boy's gaze in the rearview mirror. Yeah, buddy, he admitted. It does. Sam's hands clenched into fists. Then we have to find him before they do. Mike nodded. That's exactly what we're gonna do. As they approached the outskirts of Eagles Peak, Mike felt it deep in his bones. They were about to uncover something big, and someone didn't want them to. The ghost in the mountains. The small town of Eagles Peak was the kind of place that time had forgotten. Nestled deep in the Colorado mountains, it was a quiet settlement with a single diner, a general store, and a scattering of log cabin homes built decades ago. It wasn't a town people stumbled upon. It was a town people escaped to. Officer Mike Thompson gripped the wheel as he guided the car onto the narrow main street. Snow-capped peaks loomed in the distance, and thick forests stretched on both sides of the town, swallowing it whole. The chill in the air carried the scent of pine and damp earth. This place feels empty, Officer Johnson murmured from the passenger seat, flipping through the old case files again. Mike nodded. It's a perfect place to disappear. In the back seat, Sam Willows sat upright, his wide brown eyes scanning every street, every shadow, every face. The boy had barely spoken since they left the highway, but his fingers clutched the crumpled photograph of his parents like a lifeline. Mike parked the car outside a small diner named Judy's Cafe, the only place that seemed remotely active. A few trucks were parked outside, and through the large windows, they could see a handful of locals sipping coffee and chatting. All right, Mike said, turning to Sam. We'll start here. Let's keep it quiet, okay? If your dad is hiding, we don't want to scare him off. Sam nodded, though Mike could see the nervous energy in his small frame. As they stepped inside, the scent of frying bacon and fresh coffee filled the air. A few heads turned toward them. Outsiders were rare in a town like this, but most of the patrons simply went back to their meals. Mike approached the counter, where a woman in her late 50s was wiping down the surface. She had short silver hair and wore a blue apron that said Judy's Cafe, since 1965. She eyed Mike's uniform cautiously. "Not every day we get cops out here," she said, setting her rag aside. "What can I do for you, officer?" Mike pulled out his badge. "We're looking for someone. His name is Daniel Willows. We have reason to believe he might be in town." At the mention of the name, the woman's face changed, just for a fraction of a second. A twitch of the eye. A brief hesitation. Mike caught it immediately. She knew something. "I don't recognize that name," she said casually, turning to grab a coffee pot. Mike didn't buy it for a second. Before he could press further, Sam spoke up. His voice was small, hesitant. "My dad's name is Daniel Willows. He's tall, has dark hair. He used to carry me on his shoulders all the time." The cafe went silent. A trucker at the corner table stopped mid-bite. A waitress who had been pouring coffee froze. Everyone knew something, and they weren't talking. Mike felt tension settle over the room like a heavy fog. Judy forced a smile. "Sweetheart, I don't think I've seen your daddy around here." Mike leaned on the counter, lowering his voice. "Listen, we're not here to cause trouble. The only thing I care about is making sure this boy finds his family. If you know something, now's the time to say it." Judy's eyes flicked toward the door, as if checking to see who might be listening. Then she leaned in slightly and whispered, "You should leave. Right now." Mike narrowed his eyes. "Why?" Her voice was barely above a breath. "Because people around here don't like outsiders asking questions, and if you're looking for Daniel Willows, you're digging into something dangerous." Mike felt a cold weight settle in his gut. Before he could push further, the diner door swung open. A man walked in, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing a thick flannel jacket and a dark beanie. His face was partially hidden by a scruffy beard, but his eyes were sharp, calculating. He wasn't just here for coffee. He was here because of them. Johnson noticed it too, his hand instinctively shifting toward his sidearm. The man walked slowly toward the counter, then stopped a few feet from Mike. He didn't speak right away, just stared. "You asking about Daniel Willows?" the man finally asked, his voice low and steady. Mike met his gaze. "Yeah." A long silence stretched between them. Then the man exhaled, shaking his head. "You need to leave town. Now." Mike clenched his jaw. "Not happening." The man studied him for a moment, then glanced at Sam, who was clutching his photograph again. Something flickered across the man's face. The man sighed, rubbing his jaw. "Look, I don't know who you are, officer, but if you care about that kid, you'll turn around and drive back the way you came. Forget about Daniel Willows." Mike felt his patience wearing thin. "You know where he is, don't you?" The man's expression hardened. "Even if I did, telling you wouldn't do any good. Daniel Willows isn't someone you find. He finds you." Mike's fists clenched. He knew he was close, but something was off. People were too afraid to talk, which meant there was more to this story than just a missing person. Then he caught something. The man's right hand was scared. Old burns, likely from an accident. Mike recognized it, because Daniel Willows had the same scars. His pulse quickened. Was this him? Had Daniel Willows been standing in front of them this whole time? Mike took a slow step forward. "Daniel." The man's jaw tightened. Sam's breath hitched. He was staring at the man, his small hands trembling. "Dad." For the first time, the man looked directly at Sam, and something inside him broke. Tears welled in his eyes, his tough exterior cracking. "Sam." His voice was hoarse, filled with years of pain. Sam took a hesitant step forward. "It's you, isn't it?" Daniel swallowed hard, his whole body tense. Then, in a flash, the diner windows shattered. Gunfire ripped through the air. Mike grabbed Sam, pulling him down as bullets tore into the walls. Johnson flipped the table for cover, drawing his gun. Daniel moved fast, grabbing a shotgun from behind the counter and returning fire. Chaos erupted. Someone had followed them. Someone who didn't want Daniel Willows to be found. Mike reached for his radio. Officer under fire. I need backup. Multiple hostiles. Eagles Peak, Judy's Cafe. More gunfire. Glass shattered. Sam screamed. Then Daniel did something unexpected. He grabbed Sam and ran. Daniel, stop! Mike shouted, but it was too late. Daniel disappeared through the back door, taking his son with him. Mike's blood ran cold. He had found Daniel Willows, but now he was gone again. And this time, he had Sam. Into the fire. Mike's heart pounded as Daniel Willows disappeared through the back door of the diner, clutching Sam tightly in his arms. Gunfire still rang out behind them, bullets ripping through the wooden walls, sending splinters flying in every direction. The smell of gunpowder and burnt coffee filled the air as Officer Johnson crouched behind the overturned table, firing back at their attackers. Mike had no time to process the emotional weight of what had just happened. He had found Daniel Willows, the man who had been missing for years. But before he could even confirm the truth, Daniel had taken Sam and fled. And that meant one thing. He was still running from something. Mike ducked as another shot shattered the coffee machine behind the counter. Whoever these people were, they were not amateurs. This wasn't some small-town dispute. This was an execution squad. Mike turned to Johnson. Cover me. Without waiting for a response, he sprinted toward the back door, keeping low as another burst of bullets followed him. He slammed into the door shoulder first, bursting into the alley behind the diner. His eyes darted left and right. Nothing. Daniel and Sam were already gone. Mike cursed under his breath and took off running. The hunt begins. Eagles Peak was a ghost town at night. The few streetlights cast eerie yellow glows against the pavement, but the edges of town were swallowed by thick forest. Daniel had been smart. He hadn't gone down the main road. He had gone into the mountains. Mike's radio crackled to life. Mike, are you hit? It was Johnson. Mike panted as he sprinted forward. No, I'm fine. But Daniel took Sam. They're heading into the woods. There was silence on the other end. Then Johnson cursed. Of course he did. I need backup, Mike said, slowing his pace as he reached the tree line. Tracks in the dirt. Footprints. Fresh. Daniel was moving fast, but he was carrying a kid. He couldn't be that far ahead. I'll call it in, Johnson replied. But Mike, you realize what this means, right? If Daniel's still running, it means whoever was after him before is still after him now. Mike swallowed hard, staring into the darkness of the forest. The trees swayed in the wind, their shadows long and shifting. I know what he said. That's why I have to find them first. Then, gripping his gun, he plunged into the forest, through the darkness. Mike had been in plenty of bad situations before. Gunfights, standoffs, chases. But this was different. This wasn't just about a case anymore. This was about Sam. The boy had already been through so much, searching for a father he barely remembered. Now, after finally finding him, he was back on the run. Mike gritted his teeth and followed the footprints through the damp soil, his boots crunching against fallen branches. Daniel knew this terrain. He was moving fast, but he was carrying Sam. He wouldn't be able to keep up that pace forever. A twig snapped nearby. Mike froze, raising his gun. The forest was eerily silent. The wind whistled through the trees, but there were no footsteps, no movement. Then, a voice. Low, hoarse. Daniel, leave us alone, officer. Mike turned his head sharply. The voice had come from ahead, but it was echoing through the trees. I can't do that, Daniel, Mike called back, keeping his tone even. I'm not here to arrest you. I just want to keep Sam safe. Silence. Mike took another step forward. You ran because you're afraid, he continued. But that boy back there, he's been looking for you for a year. A pause. Then, Daniel's voice strained. "You don't understand, officer. You have no idea what you're walking into." Mike took another slow step forward. "Then help me understand," he said. Silence. Then, movement. A shape shifted in the darkness ahead. And suddenly, Daniel Willows stepped into the moonlight, face to face. Mike's breath hitched. Daniel looked nothing like the man in the photograph. His beard was thick, his eyes tired and haunted. His clothes were ragged, his hands calloused and worn. But his arms wrapped protectively around Sam, who clung to him, wide-eyed. Sam turned his head, relief breaking through his fear. "Officer Mike," the boy called out, reaching toward him. Mike exhaled slowly, lowering his gun. Daniel's body tensed. He was ready to run again. "I'm not here to take you in," Mike said, holding his hands out. "But I need to know what's going on." Daniel's jaw clenched. His eyes darted to the shadows behind Mike, then back to Sam. "They'll come," he murmured. "They always do." Mike's blood ran cold. "Who?" Daniel hesitated. Then, a rustling sound in the trees. Not wind. Footsteps. Daniel's face darkened. "It's too late." Mike turned just in time. Gunfire erupted from the darkness. Daniel grabbed Sam and dived behind a fallen tree. Mike threw himself to the side as bullets tore through the clearing, sparking off the rocks. "Stay down," Mike barked. He pulled his gun, scanning the darkness. Shadows moved between the trees, multiple figures. Daniel clutched Sam against his chest. "They found us." Mike fired 3 quick shots toward the attackers. One of them dropped. The others moved fast, ducking into the shadows. This was not just some random hit. This was a well-planned ambush. Mike's radio crackled. "Mike, what's going on? We lost your signal." It was Johnson. Mike pressed the receiver. "I found Willows. We're under attack." There was a pause. Then Johnson's voice, sharp and urgent. "Hold on. I'm bringing backup." Mike gritted his teeth. They might not last that long. The escape. The gunfire slowed. The attackers were regrouping, repositioning. Mike turned to Daniel. "We have to move. Now." Daniel didn't hesitate this time. He grabbed Sam and ran. Mike covered them, firing into the darkness, forcing the gunmen back. Then he turned and sprinted after them. The forest was dense, the air thick with tension. Every shadow felt like a threat. Then, up ahead, a small cabin. Daniel was running toward it. Mike pushed himself harder, racing after them. More gunfire. Bullets tore through the trees, kicking up dirt. Daniel kicked the door open, shoving Sam inside. Mike followed, slamming it shut behind them. For a brief second, everything was silent. Then, Daniel turned to Mike, his eyes wild. "You shouldn't have followed us," he said, his voice shaking. "You have no idea what you've just stepped into." Mike exhaled, pressing his back against the door, his gun still raised. "Then tell me," he said, "because I'm not leaving until I know the truth." Daniel's face was pale, haunted. And then, he spoke the words that changed everything. "The people who want me dead are inside the police force." Mike's breath caught. His stomach dropped. And in that moment, he realized this wasn't just about Daniel anymore. This went deeper than he had ever imagined. Varied truths. The wooden walls of the cabin groaned as the wind howled through the trees outside. The only light inside came from a flickering oil lamp, casting long shadows against the rustic interior. The air smelled of old wood and damp earth, and in the corner, a battered stove stood unused for what looked like years. Mike's heart was still pounding. Gunfire had stopped. For now. But he knew it wasn't over. Outside, somewhere in the dark, the men who wanted Daniel Willows dead were still hunting them. And now Mike was caught in the middle. He pressed his back against the cabin door, keeping his gun ready. Across the room, Daniel stood frozen, clutching Sam like a shield, his expression torn between panic and anger. "You need to start talking," Mike said, his voice low but firm. "Because I just took a whole lot of bullets for you, and I need to know why." Daniel's jaw tightened. He took a step back, glancing toward the single window, a thin sheet of glass, barely enough protection against the outside world. "This isn't just about me," Daniel muttered. "It never was." Mike's grip tightened on his gun. "Then what is it about?" Daniel took a deep breath. His eyes darted to Sam, who was clutching the old photograph of their family, looking back and forth between the two men with wide, frightened eyes. Daniel exhaled sharply and finally spoke the words that changed everything. "It's about the police." Mike's stomach dropped. "What?" Daniel looked up, his face grim. "The people after me. They're not just criminals." He paused. "They're wearing badges." Mike stared at him. "You're telling me that cops are the ones trying to kill you?" Daniel nodded. His face was exhausted, like he had been carrying this truth for years. "Not just any cops," he murmured. "Powerful ones. The kind that don't make mistakes. The kind that don't leave loose ends." Mike's grip on his gun tightened. This wasn't just about a fugitive on the run. This was something bigger, something rotten. "Start from the beginning," Mike demanded. "Now, the truth about Daniel Willows." Daniel swallowed, running a hand through his unkempt hair. He looked like a man reliving his worst nightmare. "Years ago," he began, "I worked in corporate finance. I wasn't a criminal. I wasn't into shady deals. But one day, I found something I shouldn't have." Mike leaned in. "What did you find?" Daniel hesitated. Then he pulled something from his coat pocket, a small folded document. Mike took it cautiously, unfolding it. His eyes narrowed as he scanned the text. A list of bank accounts. Names, numbers, transactions. His breath hitched. Millions of dollars. Mike's stomach clenched. He had seen documents like this before. This was money laundering. "The cops are running a laundering operation," he whispered. Daniel nodded. "Not just laundering. They're moving money for cartels. Drug rings. Even worse, and I have the proof." Mike's blood ran cold. "This was big. This is what you found." Daniel exhaled. "Yes, and when I tried to report it, people started dying." Mike's pulse pounded. "Your wife, Laura. She was a witness in the case." Daniel's expression darkened. "Yes, she tried to help. But when she went into witness protection, she disappeared." His voice cracked. "I think they got to her." Sam whimpered softly. Mike's heart ached for the boy. For years, he had believed his parents had simply left him. But now, he was learning the truth. They never abandoned him. They had been running for their lives. Mike rubbed a hand down his face. He was caught in something far worse than he had expected. "This is why you ran," Mike muttered. "Because if they found you, they'd kill you." Daniel nodded. "And now you see why I took Sam. Why I couldn't risk the cops finding him." His eyes hardened. "You can't trust your department, Officer Thompson. You don't know who's clean and who isn't." Mike's chest tightened. His own people. The force he had dedicated his life to. Was it possible that some of them were dirty? That this whole time, he had been fighting on the wrong side? A cold sweat broke out on the back of his neck. "Who?" Mike asked hoarsely. "Who in the police is involved?" Daniel hesitated. Then, he dropped the next bombshell. "Your boss, Captain Harris." Mike felt like the floor had just been ripped out from under him. His captain. The man he had worked under for 10 years. The man who sent him on this case. Mike's hands clenched into fists. "No, that's not possible." Daniel gave him a look of pure pity. "I know it's hard to believe, but Harris is involved. He was one of the first cops I went to when I tried to expose this. And the next day, my house was burned down. People started following Laura. Then she disappeared." Mike's chest tightened. If this was true, then his captain had sent him on this case, knowing that the people hunting Daniel would try to kill him too. Had he been bait? Had Harris planned for him to die out here? "Mike," Daniel said cautiously, "I know this is a lot to take in, but you have to make a choice. If you go back to your department and report this, you might not make it out alive." Mike felt rage boil in his chest. He had dedicated his whole career to serving justice. He had lived by the badge. And now, the badge itself was dirty. His thoughts were interrupted by a sound outside. A car engine. Then, headlights. Mike and Daniel froze. "Shit," Daniel whispered. Mike gripped his gun. "Stay down. Don't move." He peeked through the window. Outside, 3 black SUVs pulled up. Doors swung open. Figures in tactical gear emerged. Mike's heart dropped. These weren't just hitmen. They were professionals. Cops. One of them stepped into the headlights. Captain Harris. Mike felt rage, betrayal, and fear swirl in his gut. "You were right," he whispered to Daniel. Daniel's jaw tightened. "They found us." Outside, Harris pulled out a bullhorn. "Officer Teom Tizon." His voice echoed through the mountains. "I know you're in there. You have something that doesn't belong to you." Mike gritted his teeth. "They're going to kill us," Daniel whispered. Mike knew it too. He looked at Sam. The boy was clutching his father's arm, trembling. Mike's rage solidified into pure resolve. No, he wasn't going to let them win. He turned back to Daniel. "You still have that back door." Daniel nodded. "Take Sam. Run. I'll hold them off." Daniel's eyes widened. "Mike, they'll kill you. Run." Daniel hesitated. Then he grabbed Sam and bolted toward the back exit. Mike turned back to the front door, gripping his gun. He had a fight coming, and for the first time in his career, he was going to fight against the people he once trusted. The last stand. The cabin creaked under the weight of silence, the only sound the distant howl of the wind as it cut through the trees. Outside, the 3 black SUVs stood like predators in the moonlight, their headlights flooding the small clearing. Mike Thompson's pulse pounded in his ears. His own captain, the man he had trusted for years, stood outside the cabin, leading the men sent to kill them. This wasn't just a case anymore. This was war. From his position behind the window, Mike could see the armed men fanning out, rifles gleaming in the cold night. They were professionals. Tactical vests, military-style movements. They weren't here to arrest anyone. They were here to erase a problem. Mike exhaled slowly, his grip tightening on his gun. Behind him, Daniel Willows had already slipped out the back, carrying Sam into the darkness of the forest. Now it was just him. Mike pulled his radio from his belt and clicked it on. "Johnson." Static. Then, his partner's voice, urgent and worried. "Mike, where the hell are you?" Mike swallowed. "Eagle's Peak, cabin off Ridge Trail. I found Daniel. I found the truth." Silence. Then Johnson's voice, lower. "How bad?" Mike glanced at the men outside. "They sent a kill team. Harris is leading them." A sharp inhale from Johnson. "Jesus Christ." "Listen," Mike said, his breath coming faster. "I need you to trust me. I need backup. Real backup. Get me state police. The feds. Anyone who isn't dirty." There was a pause. Then Johnson muttered, "I'll make the call. Just stay alive." Mike lowered the radio. Outside, Harris' voice rang out. "Thompson." Mike turned toward the door, his gun steady. "You don't want to do this," Harris continued, stepping forward. His face was unreadable, but there was no mercy in his eyes. "I'll make you a deal. You walk out now. We wipe the slate clean. You can go home." Mike let out a humorless chuckle. "And what? Pretend I don't know the truth. Pretend I don't know you set this whole thing up." Harris sighed, shaking his head. "Damn shame. You were one of the good ones. Then he gave a small nod, and the gunfire started. Hell breaks loose. The first burst of bullets tore into the wooden walls, sending splinters flying. Mike dived behind an overturned table, pressing himself against the floor as glass shattered around him. They weren't holding back. They were here to kill him. Mike took a deep breath. Then he moved. Popping up from cover, he fired 2 shots, hitting one of the gunmen in the shoulder. The man dropped, cursing, but another took his place instantly. Dan, they were fast. He fired again, forcing them to take cover behind their vehicles. A voice crackled in his earpiece. Johnson. Mike, backup is coming. You have to hold out. Mike gritted his teeth. Tell them to move faster. Another wave of gunfire. The cabin wasn't going to hold much longer. Then, a crash. The front door burst open, and 2 men stormed inside, rifles raised. Mike spun just in time, grabbing the closest man's gun and slamming him against the wall. The rifle discharged, sending a round into the ceiling as Mike twisted the weapon out of his grip and delivered a brutal punch to his jaw. The second man raised his gun. Mike dropped low, dodging the shot, then fired twice. The man crumpled to the ground. The first attacker lunged, but Mike pivoted, driving an elbow into his ribs before finishing him with a hard strike to the temple. Both men down. Mike barely had time to breathe before more footsteps thundered outside. He had to move. Now. The escape. Mike grabbed a shotgun from one of the fallen men and ran for the back door. He burst into the cold night, his breath visible in the freezing air. The forest stretched ahead, dark and full of places to hide. But he couldn't just run. He had to make sure Daniel and Sam got away safely. Through the trees, movement, a flicker of motion. Mike raised his gun, then froze. Daniel. He was there, just a few yards ahead, holding Sam close. The boy's eyes were wide with fear, but he was still alive. Mike exhaled sharply. They're coming, he said. We have to go. Now. Daniel nodded, his grip tightening on Sam. There's a path. A back way down the ridge. Mike didn't hesitate. Lead the way. Behind them, the sound of shouting. Footsteps crashing through the brush. They ran. Through the forest, down a narrow dirt trail, their breath ragged in the cold air. Mike glanced back. 2 men were following, closing the distance fast. He turned, raised the shotgun, and fired. One of them dropped. The second man took cover behind a tree. No time to finish the job. Mike turned back to Daniel and Sam. Keep going. They broke through the trees, and suddenly, the forest ended. A cliffside. A steep drop into rushing water below. Daniel skidded to a stop, pulling Sam close. We're trapped. Mike turned. The gunman behind them was closing in. More were coming. Nowhere to run. Mike's mind raced. They could try to fight, but they were outnumbered. Then, sirens. Distant, but getting closer. Back up. Harris' men heard it too. The gunman froze, glancing toward the trees where flashing lights were appearing in the distance. Mike seized the opportunity. He lunged, slamming into the gunman, knocking his rifle aside. They struggled, feet slipping on the damp ground, until Mike drove his knee into the man's gut and sent him tumbling over the cliff's edge. A second later, he heard the splash. Silence. Then the squad cars arrived. Johnson was the first to step out, gun drawn, his eyes locking onto the remaining armed men. Drop your weapons. The gunmen hesitated. Then, one by one, they surrendered. And just like that, it was over. The aftermath. Hours later, Mike sat in the back of an ambulance, watching as Captain Harris was shoved into the back of a squad car, his hands in cuffs. State police had arrived in force. The case had been blown wide open. The corruption, the money laundering, the murders, it was all out in the open now. Daniel Willows sat nearby, his arm around Sam, speaking quietly with an FBI agent. For the first time, he wasn't running anymore. Mike exhaled. It was over. And then, a small voice. "Officer Mike." Mike turned. Sam was standing there, holding his worn photograph of his family. Mike smiled, crouching down. "Yeah, buddy." Sam hesitated, then wrapped his small arms around Mike's neck. "Thank you." Mike felt his throat tighten. He hugged the boy back. "Anytime, kid." As he pulled away, he looked over at Daniel, a father reunited with his son. It was worth it. Every bullet, every risk. And as Mike stood, watching the dawn break over the mountains, he knew one thing for certain. Justice had finally won.